On the day my mother died, my world ended. I was 14 years old, and my grandfather, my mother's own father, held me in his arms while I sobbed, his big, rough hands patting my back. He whispered in my ear that he would take care of me, that I would be safe with him, that he would be my protector now. And that night, in the very same house, in the bed next to my mother's now empty room, he proved that every word he had spoken was a lie. That night, he became the monster that would haunt my life for the next 65 years. That night, he abused me until I bled, and in doing so, he didn't just break my body. He tried to desecrate the memory of his own daughter. Hi everyone. I'm Grandma Anna. I am 80 years old. I live in a small apartment in a city I have no connection to. I came here to disappear a very long time ago. I have lived a quiet life, a life of shadows, a life spent trying to outrun a memory that has faster feet than I do. The story I am going to tell you today is the story that has defined me. It is the secret that has been the silent, screaming occupant of my heart for my entire adult life. It is a story of a grief so profound it shattered me, and a betrayal so monstrous it pieced me back together as someone else entirely. A harder, colder, more watchful person. I have never told this story. Not to a single soul. Not to a therapist, not to a friend, not to the kind man I almost married. How do you find the words for the unspeakable? How do you explain that the man who was supposed to be your savior in your darkest hour was, in fact, the darkness itself? The shame of it is a physical thing. It seals your lips. It weighs down your tongue. But I'm an old woman now, and I am tired. I'm so very tired of carrying this secret for him. It is his shame, not mine. And today, I am giving it back. Before I begin this journey into the past, I want to ask for your support. A small act of kindness. If you could please press that like button and subscribe to my channel, it would mean so much. It is a way of saying that you hear me, that you believe me, that even after a lifetime of silence, a voice can still matter. Thank you. Now, let me tell you about my mother. To understand the darkness, you must first understand the light. And my mother, Clara, was pure light. She was one of those people who seemed to carry sunshine inside her. She had a laugh that sounded like wind chimes, and a smile that could coax a flower from a stone. She was a single mother, raising me in a tiny, cheerful apartment above a bakery in a working-class neighborhood. The air was always filled with the smell of baking bread and my mother's quiet, happy humming. My father had died in a factory accident before I was born, so it had always been just the two of us. We were a team. A tiny, fiercely loyal unit of two. She worked as a seamstress, her fingers nimble and quick, turning scraps of fabric into beautiful dresses. Our life was not easy. We never had much money, but we had an abundance of love. Our little apartment was my sanctuary. It was filled with books, with music, with the scent of her sewing machine oil, and with a sense of absolute unconditional safety. I never once felt poor. I felt like the richest girl in the world because I had her. Her father, my maternal grandfather, was a figure who lived on the periphery of our happy little world. His name was Arthur. He was a widower who lived 2 hours away in a large, dark, silent house in the country. He was a stern, imposing man. A farmer who had worked the same land his entire life. He was a man of few words, his face a permanent mask of grim disapproval. My mother and he had a strained relationship. I didn't understand it then, but I could feel it. When he would visit, a few times a year, a cloud would descend over our sunny apartment. My mother's laughter would become brittle. Her movements would become tense. She would try so hard to please him, baking his favorite pie, fussing over him, but nothing ever seemed to be good enough. He would look at our small, happy home with a kind of quiet contempt. He would look at me with an unnerving, evaluative stare that made my skin crawl, even as a young child. "She's too skinny," he'd say to my mother, as if I weren't in the room. "And too quiet. Spends too much time with her nose in a book. It's not natural for a girl." My mother would always defend me, her voice trembling but firm. "She's a good girl, Papa. She's smart and she's happy." His visits were always a relief to see end. When his car pulled away, it was as if the sun came out again. The tension would drain from my mother's shoulders. She would hug me tight and say, "Don't you mind him, Annie. He's just an old bear." But I did mind him. I was afraid of him. There was a coldness in his eyes, a complete lack of the warmth and love I saw in every other adult in my life. He was a dark shape in the corner of my vision, a character from a frightening fairy tale. The day the light went out of my world, it happened without warning. I came home from school. I was 14. I remember it so clearly. I was humming a song from the radio. I had an A on my history test in my pocket. I couldn't wait to show her. I opened the door to our apartment, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. The unnerving, absolute silence. My mother's sewing machine was quiet. There was no music playing. I called her name. "Mama, I'm home." No answer. I found her in her bedroom. She was lying on the floor beside her bed. She had suffered a massive, sudden brain aneurysm. She was gone. The hours that followed are a blur, a kaleidoscope of nightmarish images and sounds. The ambulance, the neighbors' pitying faces, the cold, sterile feel of the hospital waiting room. And then, the doctor's gentle, terrible words. It was like a bomb had gone off in the center of my life, vaporizing everything I had ever known, everything that had ever felt safe. I was an orphan. I was utterly, completely alone in the world. And then, into that void, he stepped. My grandfather. Arthur. Someone had called him. He arrived at the hospital, a grim, towering figure in the midst of my shattered world. He looked at me, his face unreadable. And then, he did something he had never done before. He opened his arms, and he pulled me into a hug. I was so lost, so broken, so desperate for any kind of comfort, that I clung to him. I sobbed into the rough wool of his coat, the smell of damp earth and old tobacco filling my senses. He held me, his big, calloused farmer's hands patting my back in a clumsy, rhythmic motion. There, child," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. "It's all right. You're not alone. I'm here now. I'll take care of you. You'll come live with me. You'll be safe with your grandpa." In my haze of grief, those words were a lifeline. He was my family. My only family left. He was my mother's father. He would protect me. He was my savior. I believed him. I trusted him with the broken pieces of my soul. It was the most catastrophic mistake of my life. The journey from my sunny, cheerful apartment to his house in the country felt like a descent into another world. The car ride was silent, the 2 hours stretching into an eternity. I sat huddled against the passenger door, watching the familiar city landscape give way to flat, empty fields under a gray, unforgiving sky. His house was even larger and darker than I remembered. It sat alone on a huge plot of land, surrounded by skeletal winter trees. It was a house that seemed to have no warmth, no life. The silence inside was not peaceful. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, thick with unspoken things. He showed me to my room. It had been my mother's room when she was a girl. The furniture was heavy, dark wood. The curtains were thick velvet that blocked out what little light there was. It felt like a room in a museum, a room where no one had lived or laughed for a very long time. Next door was his room, and across the hall was my mother's old room, now empty, a shrine to the daughter he had barely seemed to like when she was alive. That first day, he was the picture of gruff but proper care. He made me a sandwich that I couldn't eat. He told me to rest. He spoke in quiet, formal tones. But as the sun began to set, a change came over him. A subtle shift in the atmosphere that my finely honed instincts for danger immediately registered. He started drinking. He sat in his big armchair in the dark living room, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, and he just stared at me. It was that same unnerving, evaluative stare from my childhood, but now it was different. It was heavier, darker. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My inner world was a storm of grief and a new, terrifying confusion. I was so disoriented, so lost in the fog of my mother's death, that I couldn't quite process what my senses were telling me. This doesn't feel safe. This man is not a protector. But the logical part of my brain fought back. He's your grandfather. He's grieving too. You're just upset. You're imagining things. That night, after I had cried myself into a state of raw-throated exhaustion in my cold, new bed, my bedroom door creaked open. I thought at first I was dreaming. A tall, dark silhouette stood in the doorway, backlit by the dim light from the hallway. "Grandpa?" I whispered, my voice a tiny, frightened thing. He didn't speak. He just walked into the room and closed the door behind him, plunging the room into near total darkness. I cannot give a graphic, detailed account of what he did to me that night and on so many nights that followed. It is a place of such profound horror and violation that to describe it in clinical detail would be to re-traumatize myself and to dishonor the 14-year-old girl who endured it. But I must tell you what it felt like. It felt like a second death. It felt like my soul was being ripped from my body, leaving behind an empty, broken shell. It was a violation so complete, so absolute, that it rewired my entire being. The world was no longer a safe place. Love was a lie. And the man who was supposed to be my only refuge was, in fact, my jailer and my tormentor. The abuse was not just physical. It was a campaign of psychological warfare designed to break me completely. His words were a constant, insidious poison. "You're just like your mother," he would say, his voice thick with a strange mixture of contempt and something else I couldn't name. "Weak, useless, good for only one thing." He would tell me that it was my fault. "You're a woman now. You have these urges. You lead men on. It's your nature. You should be grateful I'm here to teach you how to handle it." He isolated me completely. I was not allowed to go to the local school. He said he would homeschool me, which consisted of him throwing a few old textbooks on the kitchen table and telling me to read them. I was not allowed to use the phone. I was not allowed to leave the property. My world shrank to the confines of that dark, silent house and the empty fields that surrounded it. I had no friends, no allies, no one to tell. Who would I tell? Who would believe me? He was Arthur, the upstanding farmer. I was the sullen, strange, orphaned girl he had so graciously taken in. His narrative was already written. My life became a living nightmare, a repetitive cycle of terror and dissociation. During the day, I was his unpaid housekeeper. I cooked. I cleaned. I did the laundry. I worked in the garden. I did anything to stay out of his way, to make myself useful and invisible. I learned to read his moods with the hypervigilance of a soldier in a minefield. The slightest change in his tone of voice, the way he slammed a door, the speed at which he drank his whiskey in the evenings, all were signs I had to interpret to survive. At night, the terror began. The sound of his footsteps in the hallway was a drumbeat of doom. I learned to leave my body. It was a trick I taught myself, a desperate act of self-preservation. I would float up to the ceiling, a silent, bodiless observer, and I would watch the terrible things happening to the girl in the bed below. I would focus on a crack in the plaster, on the pattern of the moonlight on the floor, on anything that was not the reality of the moment. It was the only way I didn't go completely insane. I began to talk to my mother. Not out loud, but in my head. She became my constant companion, my only friend. I would have long conversations with her while I was scrubbing the floors or peeling potatoes. I would tell her what was happening. I would ask her for advice. I would beg her to make it stop. In my imagination, she was a fierce, protective angel. She would tell me, "Stay strong, Annie. You are stronger than he is. You will survive this. I am with you." Her imaginary voice was the only thing that kept me from shattering into a million pieces. The physical toll was immense. I was often in pain. There were bruises I had to hide, though there was no one to hide them from but myself. I stopped eating. Food had no taste. I became thin and wraith-like, a pale ghost haunting a dark house. The bleeding he caused that first night, and on other nights, was something I had to deal with in secret, in shame, washing the sheets by hand in the cold water of the laundry room sink, praying he wouldn't notice. I lived in this state of suspended animation, this living death, for 2 years. 2 years that felt like 200. I lost all sense of time. The seasons changed outside my window, but inside, it was always the same gray, terrifying winter. I had given up all hope of escape. I had resigned myself to my fate. I believed that this was my life now, and that it would only end when he died, or when I did. I was a prisoner on a deserted island, with no hope of a passing ship. The event that shattered my resignation and sparked the first, tiny ember of rebellion was not an act of violence. It was an act of what he perceived as kindness. It was my 16th birthday. He must have remembered it from somewhere, some calendar or old document. That morning, he came into the kitchen where I was washing the breakfast dishes. He was sober. His mood was neutral, which was the best I could ever hope for. He placed a small, clumsily wrapped package on the table. "Happy birthday," he grunted, not looking at me. I stared at the package as if it were a snake. A gift from him was a terrifying, confusing concept. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a small, silver locket on a delicate chain. It was pretty. It was the first pretty thing I had seen in 2 years. I opened the locket. On one side was a tiny, faded photograph of my mother as a young girl. On the other side was a photo of him, a younger, less grim version of himself. He had cut them out and placed them there. "Every girl should have something nice," he said, his voice gruff. "Your mother would have wanted you to have it." And in that moment, something inside me broke. Not my spirit, my paralysis, the sheer breathtaking hypocrisy of it, the unmitigated gall of this man, this monster, to use my mother's image, to invoke her name, in this grotesque parody of paternal affection, was an outrage so profound it was like a lightning bolt to my deadened soul. He was desecrating her memory. He was using her as a tool to further his control over me. The grief I had for my mother, which had been a passive, sorrowful thing, transformed into a white-hot, protective rage. He would not have her. He had taken my body, my freedom, my childhood, but he would not have my mother's memory. That was mine, and I would defend it with my life. The awakening was instantaneous and absolute. The fog of despair and resignation was burned away by this new clean fire. For the first time in 2 years, I had a purpose other than mere survival. My purpose was to escape, not just to save myself, but to save my mother's memory from his profane touch. My plan began to form that very day, born from a single, desperate idea. I knew I couldn't run away. He was a farmer. He knew the land. He would find me. I couldn't go to the police. It would be my word against his, and he was a respected member of his community. I needed proof. I needed a weapon. And my mind, the mind of a quiet, bookish girl, a girl who had been trained as a legal secretary's daughter, began to work with a cold, clear logic I hadn't felt in years. I knew he kept a gun in the house, an old hunting rifle, locked in a tall metal cabinet in the hall closet. I also knew where he kept the key, on the same ring as his truck keys, which he always left on a hook by the back door. My plan was terrifying in its simplicity and its risk. I was going to get him to confess, and I was going to get it on tape. My mother had owned a small portable tape recorder, a novelty item she had used to record herself reading stories for me when I was a little girl. It was in a box of her belongings that he had brought from our apartment, a box that was stored in the dusty, spider-filled attic. That afternoon, while he was out in the fields, I found it. I found a blank tape. I tested it. It worked. The next part of the plan was the hardest. I had to change my behavior. For 2 years I'd been a ghost. Silent, submissive, compliant. Now, I had to become something else. I had to become bait. That evening, when he came into my room, for the first time ever, I fought back. Not with great strength. I had none. But I struggled. I said no. I cried. I begged him to stop. It was a calculated performance, designed to confuse him, to anger him, to break the routine. It worked. My resistance seemed to excite him, to fuel his rage and his need for domination. "You're getting feisty, aren't you?" he growled, pinning me down. "You think you can say no to me? You're mine. You belong to me. Just like your mother should have. She was always too proud, too independent. But I taught her, and I'm teaching you." His words, meant to break me, were a gift. They were the first threads of the noose I was weaving for him. I continued this new pattern of resistance for a week. Each night, he would get angrier. Each night, his verbal abuse would become more explicit as he tried to reassert his total control. I was playing with fire, and I knew it. I was walking a tightrope over a canyon of absolute terror. But the image of that locket, of my mother's face next to his, fueled my resolve. The night I chose to act, I was as terrified as I have ever been in my life. But I was also filled with a strange, cold calm. I hid the small tape recorder under my pillow, the record button already pushed down. I lay in bed, my body rigid, and I waited. When he came in, I began my performance. I begged. I pleaded. I cried my mother's name. And his rage, as I had hoped, boiled over. He started yelling, his voice a torrent of pure evil. He confessed to everything, not in a single sentence, but in a long, rambling, hate-filled monologue. He told me what he had done to me, why he had done it, how it was my fault, how I was just like my mother, how he owned me. It was all there. Every vile, twisted thought in his sick mind, captured on a fragile ribbon of magnetic tape. When he was finally finished and had fallen into a drunken sleep beside me, I lay there for what felt like hours, not daring to move. When I was sure he was deeply asleep, I slipped out of the bed. I retrieved the tape recorder, and then I went to the hall closet. I took his keys from the hook. I unlocked the gun cabinet. I took out the rifle. It was heavy and smelled of oil. I also took a box of shells. I did not know how to fire a gun, but he didn't know that. I went back to my room. I sat in a chair in the corner, the tape recorder in my lap, and the rifle across my knees. And I waited for the sun to rise. When he woke up, the first thing he saw was me, sitting in the chair, bathed in the gray morning light, holding his rifle. The confusion on his face was a pleasure to behold. It slowly morphed into disbelief, and then, for the first time ever, into a flicker of fear. "What in God's name are you doing, girl?" he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "And you are not going to stop me." He started to get out of bed, a sneer forming on his face. "You put that gun down. You don't have the guts. Maybe I do," I said. "But it doesn't matter, because I have this." I held up the small tape recorder and pressed the play button. And his own voice, slurred and full of hate, filled the silent room. "You belong to me, just like your mother should have." I watched his face as he listened. I watched the color drain from it. I watched the bravado crumble, replaced by a raw, primal panic. He was looking at his own ruin. He was hearing the sound of his world ending. I stopped the tape. "I have the money I saved from the housekeeping allowance you gave me," I lied. "It's enough for a bus ticket. I'm going to walk out that door. And if you try to follow me, if you ever try to find me, I will take this tape to the sheriff, and I will tell everyone what you are." He just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He was broken. The monster had been slain, not with a bullet, but with his own vile words. I stood up, walked out of the room, out of the house, and I did not look back. I walked for 2 miles to the nearest crossroads, and I hitchhiked. The first truck that came by, a kind-faced farmer, stopped for me. I told him my mother was sick in the next town. He believed me. He drove me to the bus station. I bought a ticket with the few dollars I had, a ticket to nowhere in particular. A ticket to anywhere but there. I was 16 years old, with a tape recording, a few dollars, and a universe of trauma. But I was free. I had saved myself. And I had saved my mother's memory. I threw the rifle into a river from a bridge the bus crossed. I didn't need it anymore. The tape was my weapon, and I kept it for many, many years, a talisman against the past. The aftermath for him, I can only guess. He was a man left alone in a silent house with his own dark soul for company. His secret was safe, but he knew that at any moment it could be exposed. He lived, I hope, in a new kind of prison. A prison of fear. The same fear he had taught me to live in. The lesson I learned in that dark house is a terrible and powerful one. I learned that evil can wear the face of family. That protectors can be predators. But I also learned that the human spirit has a capacity for survival that is deeper and stronger than any darkness. I learned that you can be broken into a million pieces and still find a way to put yourself back together. It may be a different shape than before, but it is a shape that is yours, forged in fire and built to last. My advice to anyone listening who is trapped in a situation that feels hopeless, who is being hurt by someone they are supposed to trust, is this. You are not what is being done to you. You are the part of you that survives. Find that part. Nurture it. It may be a tiny, flickering ember, but it can be fanned into a flame. And your voice, your story, is the most powerful weapon you will ever own. Find a way to use it. Tell someone. Write it down. Record it. Just get it out. The moment it leaves your body, it begins to lose its power over you. Thank you for listening to this story. It has been the hardest one I have ever had to tell. To speak of it is to relive it, but it is also to finally put it down. The weight is gone. It no longer belongs to me. It belongs to the air. It belongs to the past. If this story has touched you, I ask that you not share it lightly. But if you know someone who needs to hear that survival is possible, that escape is an option, then please let them know they are not alone. And please subscribe for more stories. Stories of a life that came after. A life of peace. Love, Grandma Anna. See you in the next story.